Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today in what promises to be a very exciting webinar where I'm going to understand so many things I do not understand currently about climate change and food system sustainability. We have two amazing speakers. I just want to quickly tell you about She is Arab. We are an organization with a vision for Arab women to be represented equally in the global economy. And we're really proud to have with us two amazing Arab women today who will talk to us about the topic of climate change and sustainable food systems. Um, so this is an attempt really to simplify matters and help us all understand and learn because economic, social, and environmental sustainability are all intertwined. But the current practices of economic and social development are quite detrimental to our natural systems. I actually attended a session at the Economist Sustainability event earlier this month. And I would like to quote something I heard Bill Gates say, which is that climate change is a side effect to our physical economy. And after doing a little bit of reading in preparation for this webinar, I really believe this to be true. The current food systems are both vulnerable to climate change and are also causing climate change. So we're going to learn from Sarah and Shada about this today. Sarah is a PhD candidate in food system sustainability at Arizona State University, Sarah Sayed. She is also an entrepreneur. She's the co-founder of Nawaya, Daima, and Cleola, and she'll tell us more about this later during the webinar. She's also a researcher and teacher assistant at the Biomimicry Center, working on the LIFE's principle framework. And she's a big believer in the slow food movement. She's a board member at the Slow Food Movement chapter in Phoenix, Arizona. This is where she's joining us from today, by the way. It's 7 a.m. and she made it. So thank you, Sarah, for making the time. Shada accordingly, and she's working on a host of other initiatives she will mention to us during the webinar. She's a sustainability advocate, advisor, and mentor, and she's working currently a candidate for the MPA at the Harvard Kennedy School. She's a recognized regional expert in green economic growth, clean technology, climate change, and sustainability. So Shada, let's start with you and unpacking the lingo, as you rightly said. We keep hearing terms like the WEF nexus, the SDGs, the green economy. Tell us more. Talk to the simple minds, people who have no knowledge at all about all of this.
So yes, thank you so much, first of all, Samar and She is Arab for hosting this webinar today and for really helping us to communicate and connect with your audience. I'm sure brilliant people from all over the world connecting just right now, and really connect the dots to some of these concepts that we keep hearing and reading about, but maybe we don't see the connection to our own development agenda here in the Arab world. So one of the first topics I wanted to quickly touch on is the SDGs. We've probably all seen these nicely colored 17 boxes. And so, but what do they actually mean? So the SDGs were born in 2015, and they have attached to them 169 targets. So there are actually quite a bit of detail within each of the SDGs. And they came on the heels of the Millennium Development Goals, which the United Nations took stock of in 2015 and realized that the world did not achieve those goals. At that point in time, we still had poverty, hunger, lack of access to basic services. And so the idea behind these goals is that they're integrated and that they all strive to balance, obviously, the three pillars of sustainable development: economic, social, and environmental. So in terms of the Arab world, countries are adopting these goals in various degrees. We have entities like ESCWA, the Economic Social Council of West Asia, based in Beirut, but really tracking SDGs for the entire region. They just a few months ago issued their Arab Sustainable Development Report, which looked at the 22 countries of the region. And, maybe unsurprisingly, really, the Arab countries are not on track to achieve these SDGs. We still have to grapple with serious issues related to health, gender, poverty. Conflict is a big stifling impact in the region, our natural resource management, and of course, one of the key ones we're going to zoom in on today, which is going to affect our ability to achieve SDGs, climate change. And it's specifically when we talk about SDGs, this really relates to this concept by the UN, which is leave no one behind. And that really talks about, within development, how do we ensure that we're meeting the needs of marginalized groups? Unfortunately, women are still within that definition, people with disabilities, migrants, and refugees. So that's SDGs. Let's maybe talk about another enigmatic term that we might hear and come across every once in a while in these fancy conferences and reports. So the WEF nexus. The WEF nexus, or as Sara I learned from her, some people call it the FEW nexus, but it's basically referring to the same thing, the water, energy, food nexus, and it's an approach for development. And people, or people proponents of this approach say that it's a human rights-based approach. What do we mean by that? Because it tries to connect water, energy, and food, it is seen that these are human rights. Availability of water, energy, and food are human rights and are considered basic services. And so these are needed to be planned for holistically. You cannot plan for these services individually. And so this is basically what the nexus approach is about. And as you can see within this diagram, also produced by ESWA, we consider WEF nexus in this region in the context of, again, climate change, human rights, and sustainable development. So we're starting to zoom in. Sustainable development was the overarching. We zoomed into water, energy, food, and now we're going to talk a little bit about climate change. Now, the main thing to note about climate change is that this is beyond what's actually been happening over millennia. This is what we're observing due to human activity. Human activity specifically that releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Basically, the big culprit within those greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. Its buildup in the atmosphere is basically raising the temperature of the earth, and that brings with it a whole range of very serious impacts. And so this is why we're concerned about it, is because humans have a role to play, they impact it, and hence they have a role to kind of undo the damage, but also they have a responsibility to adapt to the kind of risks that we're facing. And so maybe as you can see in this diagram on the right, we are already experiencing anthropogenic or human-induced change, which has affected our temperature. We're already at almost 1 degree of temperature higher than we were in the pre-industrial levels. And that's a problem. And we're already starting to see its negative impacts in different parts of the world. And so this is particularly of concern to our region. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, SDG 13 is one of the 17 development goals. And there are within our region about 44 million people affected by droughts, and climate change is only going to make this worse. Our region, so we said overall 1 degree has increased in the entire world, but our region has already felt 1.5 increase. So we're feeling it worse than other regions in the world. And what this means is it's actually affecting water availability, actually affecting agricultural production, livestock production, our forests. And obviously, when you talk about agriculture, you're talking about employment, loss of a large number of people in our populations, and an increase in heat waves. And so there's a scary sort of projection that in 2080, agricultural output could decrease by 20%. And so these are serious issues. They're no longer things that we read in reports or hear about in conferences. We're starting to feel them. And if we do not act, there's a likelihood that these impacts will only get worse. Finally, I just wanted to share with you, this came out in a report earlier this week by United Nations Environment Program, which really shows one of the most dangerous impacts of climate change for our region, which is the phenomena of sea level rise. As the temperature rises across the world and ice caps melt, sea level rise takes place. And so we've got cities like Alexandria, coastal cities like Beirut. And as you can see in this graph, this shows a number of people in thousands that are at less than 5 meters above sea level, which means that these people, if measures aren't taken by these countries to protect them, are going to be at risk of flooding and losing homes and livelihoods. So basically, it's getting real. And that's the main message that I wanted to convey.
Thank you, Shada, so much. I think this, in a way, deciphers a lot of these terminologies, at least at my end. Moving on now to Sarah, to decipher some additional terminologies that we always hear. So, food system sustainability, so something that you're studying, Sarah, and I find it quite an interesting domain to look into in detail. So it would be great if you can tell us a little bit more about it.
Thank you so much for putting this together, Samar. It's very exciting that you have created this platform for us to really delve into some of these, what are now being called wicked problems. This is a term that gets thrown out as problems that are quite complex, where solutions to them do not come from one stakeholder, but from many different ones. And so I think what's important to try and transpire through this conversation, be it the work I'm doing or what Shada is doing, is that it takes engineers and biologists and civil servants and educators and farmers and all sorts of different people to come together to try and resolve these wicked problems. And we have a planet that can be very salvageable. It actually can be the opposite. We can have a flourishing planet if we put our minds to it. And so really this is where that word comes from, sustainability, is that trying to think of how we can ensure that the resources and that we have on this planet today can sustain us, the ones who are living on this plane, in a just way, in a way that is equitable to everyone, not everyone just being humans, but the species on it too, but also passing that on as a legacy to the future generations. And so that's where the word sustainability really comes from. Now, my focus is on food systems, and I thought I'd start off by illustrating what a food system looks like. So oftentimes before the last maybe 20 years or so, we would talk about very distinct kind of disciplines. You had agriculture or agronomy as being one, maybe production being another one. But recently, because of understanding this complexity and the fact that we are dealing with these very wicked problems, that we need to really address things in a systemic point of view and look at the whole system and how it impacts one another. And so a food system can just be simply defined as these different components that lead into each other. And I put it in a circle, but it might have like many different like lines that go through it, rather than just being this just circular thing. It's more of a web. So, you could be looking at production of food, which happens on a farm or in a garden even. So there understanding of what happens there. And obviously, when we talk about climate change, one of the big contributors, unfortunately, because of the system, the food system we have chosen to adopt, and I will talk about that in a second, that actually this field has created quite a bit of carbon dioxide emissions that are impacting our whole climate in a very adverse way. Actually, it is believed that a third of all greenhouse gases comes from food production in one way or another, be it the fertilizers that are used or the transportation that is used. So farm being one step. Then you have the actual production, which could be that you are just, getting tomatoes and rinsing them and putting in a box, or you are harvesting dates, for example, or, so these steps that come right after the actual farm. So it's no longer the farming practice, the gardening practice, but how do you actually produce that? And then you process it. Some things get processed, some things get dried, some things get turned into paste, like a tomato paste. And then there's a whole distribution network, and the distribution can be a local distribution. So you're thinking of purveyors that exist, small scale distributors, traders, or it could be international trade that you're talking about. So again, talking about greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide, if you're transporting bananas from Latin America to Europe, you're talking about huge infrastructure that allows that to take place. And then, of course, there's the process of cooking, and that can take place either in your household or within restaurants, small businesses, cottage industries across the world. So cottage industries is a term that talks about like smaller scale productions that take place. And then obviously there's also the issue of waste. What happens with the food that doesn't get consumed? Does it get thrown away? Does it get recycled? Does it go back to the system? So the idea is to try and assess all these different parts together. Now there are currently, you can go to the next slide, 3 kinds of types of food systems. There's the one that's kind of most known, at least in the United States, and that has been exported to the rest of the world, which is the industrial food system. And that really was born at the beginning of the 1900s with this idea of we are a growing population and we need to feed all these mouths. We need enough production so that we can feed mouths. And through science and innovation, there were some really radical changes that took place. So one of them was crop intensification. Father of this is known as Burlog. And what his research did was allow for crops to produce a lot more of that one product. And so the yield was basically higher. And at the same time, you have Haber-Bosch that come up with this Haber-Bosch process that allows us to create these synthetic fertilizers that allow us to very directly add these chemicals into the soil that enable, again, high productivity and so forth. So I put this in this context of actually a positive thing, in that as this innovation is being created, it is intended to actually save problems of the world. And so this is where wicked issues come into play, in that when these researchers were working on these things, they were trying to solve a given problem. And so one of the things that we often talk about, and this is why systems thinking and thinking in systems is important, is to try and realize what unintended consequences can come along the way. So as we start thinking, and sustainability is really a space where we start thinking about these things, as we start trying to solve our current problems into the futures, let's be cognizant and aware of what unintended consequences our current decisions might have into the future. So what we find today is that the industrial food system, yes, has created a bounty of food, but these foods unfortunately have come at a big cost. One, they have really depleted our soils. What has happened is that this intensity of chemicals that has been added into the soil has eroded soils, has turned some completely not just not plantable, but inhospitable. The classic example in the United States of the Dust Bowl, of like these arid pieces of land that have completely lost their value, is because of this intensity of chemical fertilizers. It has also, along the line, remember we talk about a food system. It's not just about agriculture, but we're talking about all these different other pieces. So you have, related to the farming practice, you have the production practice, which with industrial food products, you are focusing mainly on just a few crops that are produced in these massive, big monocrop fields. And today, the industrial food system has meant that 90% of our foods that are eaten around the world come only from 12 crops that have this big monopoly. And these 12 crops are then further processed into a myriad of different products. So corn, for example, comes into so many different products. And so you create then this ginormous industry that of agribusinesses that has a monopoly over food and determines what products come into the markets. And that then is connected also to wholesales, supermarkets and mega markets and so forth. And so this has, what this has done is that it has monopolized a lot of the money in these big industries. Now, the consequence of that has also meant that small-scale producers and farmers around the world have been pushed to the sidelines, basically, because even though they currently still produce almost 50 or 60% of the foods we consume around the world, they are not able to compete into the same market. They can't be at the same level as these big agro industries, which takes me to the next part, which is sustainable food system. So at around the 70s or 80s, there was a realization that this industrial food system is a bit of a problem, that there are consequences on the environment, there are consequences on the farmers themselves, and that the food itself might have some issues with it, that it might not be as healthy as we thought, and we are losing this big diversity of crops. And so an initiative started pushing for more sustainable food systems. And I think one of the biggest things that came out of the 70s and 80s in terms of research was this idea of pushing for organics. So organics are products that are not using chemicals. They have certain biofertilizers that are used on them. They have certain combinations of more natural kind of pesticides to get rid of pests. But it's still, unfortunately, kind of under the same kind of framework. It's still under a kind of like monocultures. You still have sustainable food systems that are monocultures. So it's not really trying to encourage this big biodiversity and so forth. But it is a good step. So the thing is, a lot of the research that I've been doing is not trying to say, okay, industrial food system bad, get rid of it. Sustainable food system not that great, get rid of it. No, all these things need to exist, but we need to leave room for also other innovations. And so this is where I think the space that's really starting to now have an interesting kind of movement globally is the space of regenerative food systems. And the idea behind that term comes from the concept of really adding something that has a positive impact. So it's not about like just sustaining something, keeping it as the status quo, but how can I actually add value? So how can I create a system of farming that not only produces good quality food and healthy food, but actually restores an ecosystem? So how can I build these kind of systems? And what's interesting is that a lot of these regenerative food systems are either inspired from smaller scale traditional practices that usually get lumped as agroecological practices. So for example, in the Americas, you have what are known as the Three Sisters or the Milpa system, where you have 3 types of crops that are grown together, and they each in turn help each other and help the soil. So you have the corn that's grown first, that's like the stalk, and then you have the beans that grow around it and fix nitrogen in the soil, so restore nutrients into the soil. And so as this bean is growing around the stalk of the corn, that's kind of like acting as an anchor, you also have the squash that goes under it, and the squash protects the soil from evaporation and so forth. And this is just one example of a system that also has strong cultural values and meanings for the people that produce it with so it's not just about the restoration of the soil, but it's also the cultural value that it holds with it. But regenerative agriculture can also take a very different form. So for example, one of the most destructive, let's say, agricultural industries, actually animal production. So cows raising and so forth. So in an industrial system, the animal production usually takes place in these big hangars, and they're fed, overfed a lot of processed corn or meals or things like that, just to make them fat. They don't move a lot. In the sustainable system, maybe they're grazing a little bit in fields and so forth. But in the regenerative system, it actually tries to imitate how naturally animals would graze. So if you take bisons that migrate in the United States or wildebeest that migrate in Africa, what happens is these large herds of animals actually move in this big collective. As they move, they, yes, eat on the grasses that are there, but they defecate and they puncture the soil as they do that. And then they move on. They don't stay in this one place. And so regenerative agriculture is now looking at how do we replicate this? And they've done this by chopping up your piece of farm into these small segments and actually moving your animals so that by the time they come back to that first spot, the actual grasses that are there have been regenerated, and we're actually focusing on the soil. And rather than putting these single grasses, actually they're building these polycultures of grasses that all help each other and create these symbiotic relationships. So what you're actually doing is you're restoring ecosystems as you're raising animals, which is what's really cool about this. I
This
stayed
is
a lot on
amazing,
this slide.
Shada. Yeah, no, but this is I mean, this is wonderful. And I want to take this opportunity to actually remind people, because of the wealth of information that you and Shada are sharing with us, to share any questions they may have using the Q&A tab at the bottom of their screens. So I think in a way we sort of understand now the different food systems, and this regenerative food system. I mean, for me, it sounds very, very logical. I mean, you'd think like, why haven't we thought of this, you know, before? And why is it only rising to the scene now? But moving on to food security and food sovereignty, which is a really also important topic. And I know that you're specifically passionate about the food sovereignty aspect of it, because when you address food security, you're talking about, you know, offering, yes, more food that perhaps can come from this industrial food system with high caloric intakes, but not necessarily nutritious in a way, versus food sovereignty. And I would really like you to share your views on this with the audience and sort of explain the difference.
Sure. The thing is, one of the things that we need to understand is kind of like the worldview that some of these concepts come out of. So food security comes out of that same mentality and concept of, we are living in a world where 1 billion people are hungry. That's a reality. This is a problem that we have. And so we need to feed these people and make sure that they have access to sufficient foods, meet dietary needs, and have a healthy lifestyle. And that's kind of the argument that food security says, which is not a wrong argument. This is an important argument. It's dictated within the United Nations like mandate. It is within the SDGs. I mean, these are important things that need to be tackled. However, what is interesting is in the late 80s, a strong movement rose from small-scale farmers, mainly in Latin America, a movement that was called, and is still called, Via Campesina, which is a collective of farmers. And literally they have farmers all over the globe today, and other people, not just farmers, producers and people who are interested in food. So it's become a very big collective. But what they said is, they actually went to the United Nations and said, it's not enough for us to just envision a world where there is sufficient food. But we as producers, we as people who create this food, need to have a voice in that. We need to dictate how this system looks like. We need to determine what foods we produce, what is culturally appropriate, how things are traded. We determine the types of farming systems, so using more agroecological practices, for example, and that we should have a right to be at these tables and have a seat in these conversations, and for foods not just to be determined by these agro businesses, and that's it. And so food sovereignty really comes from that space of rights-based approach, comes from a space of bottom-up farmers, producers who are calling into light what they think is right. Now, what I think is also interesting about that element is that it also pushes something that is, I think, crucial for us to protect, which is our culture. Our culture means that we have this incredible diversity of foods that exist around the globe, like the fact that you produce these different crops in different regions, and then each one manufactures them and processes them into delicious foods. When we talk about food security, we're just saying, okay, we just need to feed the people, they have to have like calories. But rather than envisioning a world where we're saying we are not just feeding and finding the calories, but we can actually appreciate and enjoy and develop and explore more our culture. And I think this is one of the big differences. Now, what's interesting, if you can move on to my last slide, is that this conversation of food sovereignty actually did trickle into governments across the globe. So it wasn't just a movement of people that are just demonstrating at WTO food trade agreements and things like that. It reached the United Nations, and right now there's an actual council that deals with food sovereignty issues. But what's fascinating is that it actually got voice into actual governments. So as Egyptians protested in 2011 and started rethinking what is the vision of their new future, there was actually a group of independent farmers and academics and food activists that got together and started saying, how could we rethink our food system could look like within the Egyptian constitution that was being drafted at the moment. And a big document was created. Unfortunately, most of it was not added to the constitution, but one part that was added is this one, which is Article 79, which states that each citizen has the right to healthy and sufficient food and clean water. The state shall ensure food resources to all the citizens, and the state shall also ensure sustainable food sovereignty and maintain agriculture biodiversity and types of local plants in order to safeguard the rights of future generations. Now, at this point, I have to say, unfortunately, this is just at the constitutional level. The next step is for us to operationalize this, to make this a reality, to actually turn this into policies, into programs, into research. I mean, it's a big thing to talk about food sovereignty. It's not just a line in the constitution. And I'm going to end with that.
No, and I reckon it requires a lot of education as well. So
right.
As the system.
Yes.
Shada, moving on as well for your reflections on what's happening on a policy level. Sarah mentioned an example from Egypt, but it would be great to hear about other examples from the region and outside of the region as well.
Definitely. I wanted to just thank Sarah for really helping us understand the nuance between food sovereignty and food security, because I believe still in the international discourse, maybe the terms are not used correctly, or maybe there's an overemphasis on just food security. So it is true that I think in terms of quality, sustainability, cultural involvement, and appropriateness, definitely we need to keep an eye on food sovereignty for this region. However, just to share with you some recent developments, when, as Sarah mentioned, these things need to be operationalized. They're not just lines in legal documents sitting in someone's office. So, for example, the EU, when they announced the Green New Deal just a couple of months ago, and they announced it in the wake of COVID. This is something we really need to keep in mind, is that adhering and committing to an approach like this is seen as a way to rebuild economies, rebuild agricultural systems that are more resilient and that can deal with shocks like COVID, like climate change, like conflicts. And so that's something to keep in mind, is that this is not just a new agey concept. It's really, countries are taking it seriously as the path for development. So the EU has put out a farm to fork strategy as part of their Green Deal. What that really means is, like, as we saw in the food system definition, this looks at, at the production level, at the processing, at the consumption, what people are able to access, so that organic, good quality products are not just elite for the elite, but that they're accessible to the entire population at affordable prices. And obviously looking at the food waste aspect. Here in Jordan, also a couple of years ago, we launched a national strategy and action plan for sustainable consumption and production. And if you remember, that's one of the SDGs, SDG 12. Within that plan, we looked at 3 sectors: transport, agriculture, and tourism. And so within agriculture, several projects were identified that really try and embed this concept of food security and sovereignty in Jordan, and really working directly with the farmers and farming systems and engaging them more holistically. It's interesting to see in the UAE, it's a country that has its own food security ministry. And we notice here that within the UAE, they use the terminology of food security. So maybe with time, this might evolve to food sovereignty. But that does include things like, looking at aquaculture, financing. Obviously the Arab world, we're going to mention this later on, but, we depend a lot on importing our food. So if there's one thing I think that the COVID pandemic has also taught countries of the world, and the region specifically, is that whatever you call it, security or sovereignty, that needs to be tackled urgently for countries of the region. And so we see that manifesting in different ways and using different policy tools.
I need to unmute myself. I was talking with the mute button on. So I think we're going to move into a different section of the presentation where we ask each other some questions and answer them. So my first question to you, Shada, is what do you think are the environmental footprint impacts on the current food system?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we need to kind of bear in mind that there's a sort of two-way relationship between climate and food. So, on the one hand, food, and as you demonstrated, the food systems both contribute to the climate problem. So it is, yes, contributing to about a third, or here we see 24% of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So it's major, right after energy. So when we talk about, how do we meet Paris Agreement? How do we cut down emissions? We're not just talking about renewable energy, and that's also very important, but we also need to be rethinking the carbon footprint of the agricultural sector. Of course, when we talk about the environment, it's not just carbon. Agriculture does withdraw about 69% of water, and it takes up a lot of land. 38% of the Earth's surface is going to a lot of agricultural activity at the expense of native trees and forests. And so that's sort of in terms of what it's contributing to the climate change. At the same time, climate change is going to place pressures on agriculture, as we demonstrated, in light of water scarcity issues. And so there is a need also for this sector to adapt to climate change. And that has to do with how do we find more water, efficient crops, and looking also at building more resilient forests and biodiversity. And so that interplay is something we have to keep in mind. So agriculture both impacts and is impacted by climate change. Just to reiterate the statistic that both of you have raised, is that we do have, all of what we're discussing has to be looked at from a very serious lens of serious hunger in the world and serious food waste issues in the world. And so whatever solutions we introduce need to also balance those considerations.
I'd like to add actually onto that. So you're absolutely right. This is the crux of the issue, is that climate change is both, exacerbated by agriculture and the way we produce food, and is going to harm it. But what's fascinating, I think the research is showing, is that the solution to this actually might exist also in food systems. So, for example, there is this really interesting organization in France called 4 per 1,000 that is saying that actually, if we thought of agriculture in a different way, if we change the way we produce our food, we can actually capture 4 parts per 1,000. This is why it's called like this, into the soil. So we could be, through reforestation, through soil amendments, through regenerative food farming practices, these emissions that we are actually producing, that are impacting, that are causing climate change, could be captured into the soil and reverse the climatic changes. So what's interesting about what you're saying is that, yes, it caused the problem. It is going to be exacerbated, but it can also be the solution to the problem.
Absolutely. That's a very important layer to add, Sarah. I'd also be very interested maybe now to take the discussion towards best practice. So, how do we translate a lot of these? We've talked a lot about the problems, the challenges, what needs to be done, but on the ground, can you share with us some examples of what communities in other parts of the world are doing?
Definitely. So first of all, I'm going to start with something Samar introduced me with, which is I'm very passionate about this organization called Slow Food. This is an international movement that started out of Italy 35 years ago, but has now chapters in 150 countries. And the basic premise of this organization is that we need to safeguard and protect the traditional practices that exist within each country, within each community, the indigenous practices and so forth, but bring them to the stage where they can be modernized enough that they can be competitive in a global market. And so the work happens through thousands and thousands of volunteers that work in local communities across the globe. Where I lived in Egypt, we had over 100 members in it. We had 5 chapters across Egypt. And we have a whole variety of different activities. And I wanted to put a plug in for this because sometimes people are wondering, what can I do? How can I learn more? How can I educate myself? And what's fascinating is because of COVID-19, we would usually have every 2 years this incredible celebration that takes place in Italy every 2 years. So this would be the year in September, where farmers, producers, chefs, cooks, academics would all come together, thousands and thousands of people, where we would exchange a whole bunch of different things, brain, food, everything, like you name it. It's just an incredible mind, body, soul kind of experience. But they decided with COVID to bring that experience to the world online. So you have, starting October 1st until April, 6 months of online programming on this website, terramadresalone.gusto.com. Lectures and speakers and food talks and demonstrations and all sorts of different things, coming not just from the headquarters that are in Italy, but from all over the globe. And so there will be something for you. There are topics in all sorts of different languages. And I feel like this is one way that people can activate their local, you know, their local economy and local food production.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Shada. I mean, these are all really great examples from all over, and I think I've personally learned a lot so far from everything that you've shared. Obviously, yes, the pandemic has, you know, highlighted stark inequalities in our world, and food has been a major concern with the supply chain interruptions and everything. But there are so many best practices and examples that we can really learn from, like whether on an individual level or on a corporate level initiatives. For example, I came across the Green Roofs of Cairo project, you know, which was all about planting the roofs of Cairo with the simple crops like leafy greens like parsley and radish and so on, and in a very sustainable practice. For example, in Dubai, there was the carbon footprint calculator, which was launched in Ramadan of 2019. So it actually helped us calculate how much emission we are sort of causing depending on our food choices. And I found this to be really interesting, in addition to initiatives like, you know, Meatless Mondays and a host of others. But I'd like to continue on this, the front of, you know, the relationship between man and culture and nature. And this is something that, Sarah, you're very passionate about. So you have strong opinions as well about how us as Arabs, for example, actually used to eat sustainably, and then due to, you know, globalization and westernization of dishes and practices and the fast food and so on, our habits have changed, and unfortunately to the worse in a way. Based on that, you have come up with, I mean, based on that and everything else you've talked about, a number of entrepreneurial initiatives that I'd love you to shed some light on, specifically Nawaya, which focuses on small-scale farmer communities in Egypt. So can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Sure. I'd like to preface that with a little bit, just to give context to what you said about, you know, the cultural aspect. So I'm not advocating a return to the past. This is not what this is about, but it is rooted in an understanding of what our culture brings. And oftentimes when you talk about food, it comes out of a context that is related to your environment. So if you're in an arid region, you develop foods that are adapted, that are well acclimatized to this area, and therefore whatever foods come out of it, and practices like preservation techniques, drying techniques, fermentation techniques, whatever it is because of these circumstances. And so these are time-tested solutions. The question is, how do I bring in technology and modernity in a way to make them healthy, safe, marketable, and able to be in today's, you know, economy, basically. You know, so for example, I'll just give a small example. The Egyptian diet, which is a kind of Mediterranean diet, and by the way, like one of the big things that is advocated around the world right now is like the Mediterranean diet, the classic diet that is supposed to be very healthy. Well, Egypt had its own Mediterranean diet that was full of leafy greens, antioxidants, different practices of like producing kishk, which is a fermented food that has all the proteins that a child might need as they're growing up. So there's a lot of good stuff, but maybe the way it's being produced in a small household in a rural village is just not accessible. So we need to be proud of what we have and just bring it to the world, bring it to ourselves first, and then bring it to the world. So really, this is kind of the thinking behind all this stuff, is like, how do you preserve your identity, your culture, but also bring it to the world in a way that makes you competitive in a global economy. So this is where Nawaya came into place. So Nawaya was like a brainchild of a few of us. Actually, another co-founder is one of the participants here today, Aurelia Vines. We basically started up with this idea that small-scale producers and small-scale farmers in the outskirts of Cairo don't have the ability to flourish and grow and be sustainable. And from there came the idea, well, let's find out what our practices are, improve on them, and produce products that are competitive. And from there came the idea of like, okay, let's look into the main thing we produce are grains. We produce wheat. Can we grow our traditional grains? Can we regrow some of these things? And then once we have them, what do we do with them? Well, can we turn them into products that are traditional, like bateo, which is a traditional Egyptian food, but make it in a way that is actually accessible to the market. So rather than bateo being this big, humongous piece of bread that is like sold in a market with flies on it, very inaccessible, we put flavors in it, we packaged it into small things, but you still have a traditional product that's being sold. We did the same thing with a breed of chickens that's called the Begawi chicken that is almost 3,000 years old. Try to revitalize it, making sure that women in different villages are raising it, but raising it with good standards. And it turns out that the Dutch had already thought about this earlier on and had realized the significance of this Begawi chicken, and it's sold around the world as a breed to actually improve on your chicken varieties, but we are just like throwing it off as not something important. So the idea is like, how do we work on valorizing what we already have in a way that makes us competitive, and still products that are adapted to the local environment, that are actually more environmentally friendly, that maybe are regenerative in the way that we farm them and produce them.
No, that's great. And I mean, Shada, also you're involved in a number of initiatives through Sustain MENA and through Donut Economics Action Lab, and you're doing a host of things. If you can just briefly mention them as well, because we have a couple of questions I'd like to attend to. We're actually running out of time. We have 10 minutes left, and I'd love to get to the questions. Please go ahead.
We can clearly talk about this all day, but yeah, just to answer your question, I mean, even in Jordan, I think what Sarah is talking about through Sustain MENA, one of the things I tried to do is really shed light on local initiatives that are translating a lot of these concepts into action. And if I can make just plugs to some of these very inspiring initiatives going on right now in Jordan. So we have a group that's right now trying to collect native seeds and plants and grow native forests. So I'll mention Sayun and the Midorization project. I was contacted recently by a young entrepreneur. So I also wear the hat of being a mentor for a number of green entrepreneurs. And the reason I think that's so important is because in the Arab region, unemployment is an issue. And so what we talk about here today, I think, can have direct impacts on our economies, because these opportunities can create jobs. They have room for innovation. They have room for people to reconnect, reappreciate, re-celebrate our culture and our heritage. And so I was recently contacted by a young woman who just established a baking business based out of taking food waste and producing beautiful loaves of bread by different flavors. Others have been doing composting related work. And so in my role as a mentor and in my role as Sustain MENA, I like to shed light on these opportunities. Just quickly on the cultural note, behind me you see Petra. The Nabateans built it thousands of years ago. And within those systems, they had actually already built very sophisticated water conveyance systems. And so there's a lot of knowledge in our part of the world. And so even though I showed you at the beginning the SDGs and all these relatively recent frameworks, the concept of sustainability, the concept of waste, not wasting, but sort of conserving resources, stewardship of the environment, our relationship with nature are things that are embedded. And I think that COVID and just us being sort of in lockdown and just being more alone with our thoughts and alone with our gardens has sort of helped us to find that relationship, re-explore it, and re-own it for ourselves and our region. So there's a lot of exciting things going on. Thank you.
That's amazing. Thank you, Shada. And on your point, actually, on the same note, Lauren is asking if there are any regenerative farms that she can support in Jordan. And she'd like you to re-mention the name of the bakery you mentioned.
Yes, Lauren is one of the most active people in our social media community. She recently hosted a clothes swap, which is wonderful. And I think this sort of sustainability thinking is contagious, and people start finding ways of applying it in all sorts of sectors. So Lauren, it's Plate Bakery. I'll tag them on social media shortly. And obviously you might have heard of Tayoun and the Minerization Project working on the regenerative forests and a host of others. So thanks for your interest, Lauren.
Perhaps we can send a few of those in a follow-up email to today's attendees. I'd like to move on to Max's question, and maybe
there's
Sarah.
also, sorry, Greening the Desert is a project that's in Jordan also, that is
Greening the Desert.
Permaculture program.
That's right, the Groasis and permaculture work. Yep.
Wonderful. I'll include those as well. Could you, Sarah, comment please on agroecology and some of the technological complications of moving towards that system of agriculture? That's a question from Max.
So really what we're looking at, again, talking about that idea that I had earlier, which is thinking about how we can take traditions and move them forward. Really the innovations I think that should happen is, how do I take a system like the Three Sisters, the Milpa system, bring in technology to facilitate? Because one of the big oppositions of some of these agroecological practices is that they're not efficient enough. So we often think about industrial farms as being super highly efficient. However, it's at a cost. And so what we need to do is try to reconcile these things. So maybe we don't have this full-on efficiency, but it's optimization, meaning that instead of having 40% food waste, which is what we currently have, 40% of the food produced in the world is thrown away, is wasted. Rather than think of that, let's try and optimize on this stuff. Let's try not to reach that point where we're actually wasting food. And so in smaller scale agroecological systems where you have a closer connection to your markets and so forth, waste is probably going to be a lot less. And so the real answer to this, I think, is we do need to bring in technology. We need to advance these agroecological practices, but in a way that is not just focused on profit and maximizing yields, and rather thinking about how this whole system is more optimized rather than just efficient.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Shada, I move on to you. There's a question about, could you provide important, you've mentioned education a few times throughout, both of you actually. Could you provide important environmental pillars that need to be discussed on a large scale in educational institutions?
Sure, I can take a quick stab at that. So, I think it all starts with a very young age. Just part of the experience that children have. I was very lucky to be able to send my children to a preschool that had a beautiful garden with animals, and they were involved in planting and learning the different types of plants and seeds. And so for them to observe that life cycle and learn from it firsthand. So I think the practical aspect is very important from a young age. But I also think in terms of pillars and topics that need to be covered just in the national curricula at the primary or education level, definitely the type of agricultural systems that Sarah is talking about need to be more mainstream, but also climate change itself and how it affects all sectors, sustainable consumption and production. So this kind of thinking, the circular economy, needs to get further embedded in the educational system from K to 12 and then further on. And then obviously the vocational side, we shouldn't just be focused on the theoretical degree side, but also more vocational hands-on training opportunities.
Awesome.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I would add, so the term that I really like to work with is this idea of eco-literacy, that we've kind of lost our understanding of the natural world and how we fit into it rather than dominate it. And so by starting with gardens and being out in nature and just understanding, our whole body is made of microorganisms and we can't just get rid of all of them. We are in relationship with nature all the time. So having an awareness and eco-literacy, I think, is an important pillar. And I'm going to put a plug-in in there, which is that I actually have a small company called Daima that takes young students on educational trips to kind of connect them to nature. And so if you're interested, I can plug it into the chat as well.
That's awesome. I could actually, I'm definitely going to make sure to include it in that email, Sarah, because I really think, and I'll include your social media handles as well, so that everyone can follow on these awesome initiatives. I love this eco literacy concept. I think I should delve into that myself, actually, even with my own children. I have an interesting question here from Justa, which is, to what extent is the political uptake of the ideas mentioned here and the ideas represented within the local movements necessary within MENA? Like you mentioned, Sarah, you kind of touched upon this briefly about like how much was presented, but how little was actually taken forward. But would love to get both your reflections on this, because I know that Shada, you work a lot on the policy level as well.
Yeah, I can start with that part specifically. Political will is so important, but it also can be pushed by people. People can ask, can demand for changes to take place. You know, like we have in Egypt, we have a strong independent farmers collective that has been protesting and rioting for decades now. These things are important. But yeah, unfortunately, we know what the situation is with many of the Arab states, and the political will is not always there. But that doesn't mean that things don't get done, because on the grassroots level, I think that there's a lot of great initiative and a lot of momentum that comes from the youth in the Arab region. So yes, you're right, it is a hindrance, but it's not a hindrance to the extent that things don't get done.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just maybe quickly building on that. I know we're coming close to time, but you know, for this transformation to take place, there needs to be sort of brave vision, top down and bottom up, vision and action. And I would just share an example that was heartening to me. You know, in the latest speech to the United Nations General Assembly, King Abdullah did mention, you know, the importance of rebuilding our relationship with Earth, and that Jordan's putting forward a new convention for the environment, sort of giving or promoting the right to existence of every living thing on land and on water. So you see Arab leaders like that making such statements. And sometimes people think that these things are so high level, so far off, it'll take a long time for it to translate to anything real. But it is very important, you know, at that high level, to hear those signals, to hear that language become more mainstream. That it's not just people like Sarah and myself talking about these things in conferences and writing papers, but that it just becomes part of the national discourse. And so here I would like to say that Jordan has done its homework. You know, it's issued like a national green growth plan with details for 6 sectors. My dream is for that plan to be the central sort of blueprint for our development. And a lot of countries now are talking about build back better. And so, you know, what we're talking about here today becomes the mainstream and not somehow something that's exceptional or elitist or difficult. It's really the kind of thinking we need to take us into the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shada. I think with that, we've actually run out of time. And this was extremely educational and informative. I mean, really, this sounded just like what we're constantly talking about specifically for SDG 5 when it comes to gender equality, gender mainstreaming. It's sort of like almost the same thing. You're saying that climate change, or perhaps, I don't know what you would call it, environmental mainstreaming, or like really caring about the planet, and mainstreaming it across the board on an individual level, on a corporate level. Everybody has a role to play. I have multiple takeaways from this session. I want to specifically highlight the importance of, you know, systems thinking, considering unintended consequences of any decisions that we make, even the food that we put on our plate. I mean, I know that even in the US, the food pyramid guide has been replaced with that plate. But then again, you know, corporates and major players in the food industry have a role to play with what is suggested to be put on your plate. So being very informed and taking these decisions wisely, the importance of eco-literacy, and also top-down and bottom-up approach in looking or addressing this issue. So really taking into consideration the people, the culture, grassroots organizations, and the entire ecosystem of subsystems even. So thank you both for being with us today. This was great. And I promise to follow up with an email with all of the great initiatives that you have mentioned. I had a bunch of questions I was hoping we would have time to go through, but unfortunately we did it. So perhaps we should schedule a follow-up session for that. So I'll give you a chance to say any last words. Sarah, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I wanted to thank both of you and Shada. I feel like I learned through the session as well. So this was really important. I think it's always important to try and build on each other's knowledge. And so I thank you, and continue exploring your local foods and explore, the biodiversity that exists. And let's move forward by taking our history with us.
Yep.
Awesome. Shada, any last comments?
I just wanted to say that the feeling is mutual. I learned a great deal from Sarah, from your very intelligent questions, Samar, and the questions of the people here. I think we just need to keep those connections and those conversations going, not to work in our silos, because our strength comes from our cooperation and building on each other's unique added value in the conversation. So thank you so much for this. Yeah.
Thank you so much. All the best. Have a lovely day.
Bye everyone. Thank you.